From beach towels to tea towels, and from mugs to water bottles, the TNT Shop has it all. Browse our shop now at tntradio.live. Hrvoje Morić on today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
All right, welcome. Bienvenidos, dobrodošli. Hour one, some quick news. Never a shortage of news. Well, that's not true. Sometimes there is, but it's another crazy news day. The algorithm ghetto in Iran. Iran's plan to freeze bank accounts reinforces the need for decentralized currencies to exist in tandem with cash and CBDCs. A member of the Iranian parliament has told local media the government plans to impose new punishments on women who do not wear a hijab in public, with individuals who refuse to comply after two warnings, possibly having their bank accounts frozen. By the way, I think I mentioned some days ago that it was announced that Iran would do away with their morality police and the hijab. They think twice about the hijab. Some are saying that was fake news. And now this. So the social credit algorithm ghetto comes in all flavors. It's what I've been saying since the beginning. And there's a meme that I saw just now that encapsulated what I've been saying for years. Once they make the world cashless, they will ban you from participating in society because you don't conform with community guidelines, just as they do with social media. So in Iran, the community guidelines are women wear the hijab. In the West, you've got all sorts of community guidelines, where if you're conservative and you don't like LGBT stuff, or if you don't believe that the weather, that we are causing hurricanes or yada yada, then you'll have your bank account frozen and you will starve to death for your own good. So that's Iran. Some good news though. Brittney Griner, the WNBA star who was serving a decade-long prison sentence in Russia, has been freed in a prisoner swap for arms dealer Viktor Bout. One of my past guests, Daniel Estulin, wrote a good book about Bout like a decade ago. Shadow War, I think I read it like a decade ago. And so that's good news for the both of them, for Viktor Bout and Brittney, that they're both free. I'm happy for both of them. And get a load of this joker, Albert Bourla. Bourla in Spanish means like to make a joke. Pfizer boss refuses to testify to EU Parliament COVID panel again. Bourla has once again declined to testify before the European Parliament Special COVID Committee. That's a strike too. Since the October COVID hearing, we have no further info to share with the committee, so respectfully decline the invitation to again revisit these issues, states the letter from Bourla. This is from Politico breaking. So, immunity from the genocideers. Some Mexico news we all have heard about in Peru. President Pedro Castillo has been apprehended. Apparently he was... AMLO, Mexican president, has revealed that ex-Peruvian president Pedro Castillo requested asylum from the Mexican government before his arrest, sort of like what Evo Morales of Bolivia succeeded in doing, fleeing to Mexico. He called the office here so that they would inform me that he was going to the embassy, but surely they had already tapped his phone. He was going to request asylum, said López Obrador. I think I did read developing news that they are still trying to extract him here to Mexico. And in that Mexico news, I thought I would just mention, I think this is a joke article. I don't know. What do you think? This is being reported in Western MSM. Putin has a plan to flee to South America if he loses the war in Ukraine, former aide says. He can join us down here in Mexico. AMLO has told Julian Assange, she'll give him asylum in Mexico. We've got a lot of alt media down here in Mexico. Evo Morales fled to Mexico. Castillo wants to flee to Mexico. So Putin come on down. The article says Russian President Putin has a plan to flee to exile in South America if he loses the war in Ukraine. The Kremlin began working on a backup plan, unofficially dubbed Noah's Ark, in the spring, said Abbas Galyamov, a political consultant and ex-speechwriter to Putin. Galyamov cited, it's always citing unnamed insiders for his information. Maybe it was some anonymous forum on Telegram. He has not worked for Putin since 2010 and is himself living in exile from Russia. I wonder how much he's getting paid by the National Endowment for Democracy or the CIA or the Republican Institute or Open Society or whatever. I don't know. I think this is just silly. I mean, I'm not believing this. Come on. And I guess one more story. Right. The new president of Peru, funnily enough, was hanging out with Klaus Schwabowski at the World Economic Forum, Dina Boluarte. So it really seems like they're just smashing on through from Canada, the U.S. down to Brazil, now Peru. The WEFers, they're putting the Davos crowd into power all over the place. It's not looking good. A reminder that if you have a suggestion for guests or hosts that you would like to hear on TNT Radio or topics you want us to cover, our door is always open. You can fill out the suggestion form at the top of tntradio.live or message any one of us individual presenters. We all have our own message form. We are happy to chat with you as well. My email is hrvojemoritz@tntradio.live. One simple way to help make a difference on TNT Radio.
Stream us wherever you are.
I listen on Alexa.
Today's News Talk Radio.
TNT.
There is a battle brewing between privacy rights advocates and free speech supporters in Europe. Even though both sides might consider big tech their common enemy, they just can't seem to get along lately, especially when it concerns the issue of people's right to be forgotten online. Here to discuss, joining me now is TNT Radio News producer and co-host of Joseph Arthur's Technicolor Dreamcast, Adam Ruckus Clark.
Thanks, Rory. This is kind of a new one on me. To be honest with you, I had never heard of this right to be forgotten thing. So this is interesting. As reported by the Epoch Times, the European Union's top court has ruled that Google must honor requests to delete search result data at the request of people in Europe, as long as they can prove the information is, quote unquote, manifestly inaccurate. Not sure what that means. The Court of Justice of the European Union, CJEU, made the December 8th judgment in a case involving two managers from a group of investment companies who had asked Google to scrub search results linking their names to certain articles that were critical of the group's investment model. The executives, who have not been named, argued that the articles made false claims and wanted Google to remove them from search results, according to the CJEU. But the tech giant refused on grounds that it did not know if the information in the article was accurate or not. The pair also wanted Google to delete thumbnail photographs of them from a list of search results. Google also refused to comply with that request. The managers sued, and the case was brought before the German Federal Court of Justice, which sought the opinion of the CJEU to interpret the rules in the context of the EU's strict Data Privacy Directive, which governs the right to erasure, often referred to as the right to be forgotten. In its ruling, the CJEU sought to strike a balance between privacy concerns and people's right to access information. The court said in its ruling, the operator of a search engine must dereference information found in the referenced content where the person requesting dereferencing proves that such information is manifestly inaccurate. That's a lot of legalese there. As a general rule, people's right to protect their private life and personal data overrides the right of internet users to access the information in question, the CJEU said in a press summary of the ruling. That balance, however, may depend on the relevant circumstances of each case, in particular on the nature of the information and its sensitivity to the data subject's private life, weighed against the interest of the public in obtaining the information. So apparently, this has been going on for a few years now, this clash between privacy rights advocates and free speech supporters under the right to be forgotten principle of the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR. People in the EU have the right to ask Google and other search engines to delete links to outdated or embarrassing information about themselves, even if that information is, in fact, true. But organizations don't always have to comply with such requests. A GDPR fact sheet explains, quote, "The right to be forgotten is much more complicated than an individual simply requesting that an organization erase their personal data," end quote. For instance, the right to erasure holds if there are significant errors, within the data, or if the information is being stored unnecessarily. EU authorities said in the fact sheet, quote, "But this is not an absolute right." If it were, the critics who argue that the right to be forgotten amounts to nothing more than a rewriting of history would be correct. Thus, the GDPR walks a fine line on data erasure, end quote. Besides inaccuracy and lack of storage necessity, the list of conditions for the right to be forgotten to be applied successfully includes a situation in which the organization in question processed that data unlawfully. Another condition is if the organization is processing personal data for direct marketing purposes and the data subject objects to such processing. The right to be forgotten rule can be trumped under circumstances that include the data being used to, quote, "exercise the right of freedom of expression and information," end quote, or if the data being processed is necessary for public health purposes. Also, in cases where the data comprises, quote, "important information that serves the public interest, scientific research, historical research, or statistical purposes," end quote, and its erasure would impair progress toward those goals. Have you ever heard of this thing, Hrvoje, the right to be forgotten? And would you like to have that right? Would you exercise this right? Do you want people to forget you?
Yeah, as a European, as an EU citizen, unhappily, I have known about this, but I think that the EU has the right itself to be forgotten. I'd like to forget the EU. It's for me, it's kind of absurd though, this EU's, going after Google or whatnot. I mean, what does this matter if the EU itself is proposing? They demand to have access to our emails. Like, they want the ability just to go into, as a European, or I think any email providers within Europe, which mine is, that they want to be able just to go right in, go look through any and all of my emails, or be able to access any of my messenger chats, whether it's Signal or Telegram or WhatsApp or Threema or SwissGuard or any. It's nuts. So I mean, for me, this right to be forgotten thing becomes a moot point when you see how totalitarian the EU. And then I was just mentioning Albert Bourla, the Pfizer head, who refuses for the second time to testify at the European Parliament. Him and Ursula von der Leyen. They deleted their WhatsApp chats. They have the right to have their corruption forgotten, but we don't. So in a way, it is, I guess, nice, this option, but I don't think Google at the end of the day would delete anything. They would remove it maybe from the public search engine, but I don't doubt it would be in some corner of Google warehouse where their servers are stored. So yeah, I mean, it's in comparison of all this other digital tyranny, for me, the right to be forgotten is just kind of like it's a small thing. I don't know.
That's a good point about this does not necessarily mean that this data is being deleted. They're just removing it from the search engines. And I know a little bit about SEO, search engine optimization, and how these things work. So the information would still be available. So if you had a direct link to this thing that exists somewhere on the internet, you could still view it. They're just like trying to remove it from the internet. So I think it's a bit of a misnomer, but maybe a little bit of a psyop gaslighting thing. This to call it the right to be forgotten is like, imagine if like somebody says something embarrassing about you that you don't want the world to know or anyone to know, and then they remove it from the search results based on your request. And you're like, oh, phew, thank God that's been forgotten. And you just go on with your life. Well, no, 10, 20 years from now, yeah, the European Union could pull that up or a company could pull that up. Who knows who could pull that up? It doesn't mean it goes away. And the powers that be certainly are not a fan of privacy. They want to know, track and trace and control everything we're doing. That's why they want everything on the blockchain. You know what I mean? I like the blockchain, some things about it, but the part I don't like is that that's forever. If they're going to, there's not going to be any way you're going to have a right to be forgotten once they start putting all your stuff on the blockchain, folks. Just a heads up. By the way, as a side story, I thought this was kind of amusing based on what you were saying. So I'll leave you with this. I guess yesterday, Apple announced a string of new security features, which included a full end-to-end encryption for nearly all of the data that its users store on its cloud storage. And I guess the FBI is coming out saying they're a little concerned about that. So what does that tell you? But yeah, I'll leave it at that. Thanks, Rory.
The feds are not happy. And by the way, I don't have the right to be forgotten because Google has already preemptively deleted me in the Google search engine. Well, by podcast. So if you type Geopolitics and Empire or Geopolitics and Empire podcast into the Google search engine, you won't find it. So they've already decided to forget me. But if you type it into any other search engine, DuckDuckGo, Quant, Yandex, Start Page, Swisscows, all of my stuff comes up, but not in Google search. So I've already been forgotten, but that's okay. Less eyes on me, the better. We'll be right back after this break.
Politically Incorrect on TNT Radio.
Drones, they appear to be a fairly effective weapon. Is the Australian Defence Force on top of that particular thing, or are we a bit remiss?
Many years ago, we actually decided that drones were unfair weapons and we wouldn't arm them. And one Minister for Defence actually said that it's very unfair to kill someone when you're sitting in a caravan with a little Xbox and he's out in the field there, and suddenly you drop a grenade on him or you drop a Hellfire missile on him and kill him. So we're not planning on getting it. We had an order in for the Predator. Now the Predator was actually made obsolete in 2018 and we weren't going to get ours until 2021. We got an obsolete weapon, but it was still very good. And we recently cancelled it because we want the money for other things. Mm-hmm. So we're not going to have any armed drones. And yes, I pointed out there have been 8 wars fought where drones have not been the decisive weapon entirely, but they've been very advantageous to the people using them.
Politically Incorrect with Mike Tennessee and Richard Carson on today's News Talk, TNT Radio.
Affordable housing, we can build that. Sustainable housing, we can build that. At MIT Modular, we understand the importance of housing for all and the importance of design, cost, and functionality. Our goal is to meet the needs of our growing population by converting shipping containers to livable units. If you're like-minded and in a position to invest in something meaningful and life-changing, we want to hear from you. We are a team of professional architects, engineers, and financial and tax experts dedicated to offering unique solutions that provide a brighter future. Our Opportunity Zone Fund offers investors both real estate and operating business diversification, 5-year tax deferral on capital gains, annual tax benefits, and ultimately tax-free appreciation potential. There are opportunity zones all over America. If you're interested in learning more about our services, need affordable housing, or want to participate in creating a new vision for tomorrow, give us a call in the U.S. on 385-985-5702. Or read more at mitmodular.com. MIT Modular. We can build that.
Global warming? Northern Hemisphere snow cover at 56-year high, and one of the coolest springs in the Southern Hemisphere were ignored by the climate fascists at COP27. Europe and the UK faces a really cold winter. There is no climate emergency. Lighting the fuse for freedom. Today's News Talk, TNT Radio.
It's been a good number of months, I think, half a year or more. But joining me again is Dr. Paul Robinson, professor in the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa and a senior fellow at the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy. He's the author of numerous works on Russian and Soviet history, including Russian Conservatism, published by Northern Illinois University Press in 2019. I went to Northeastern Illinois, small school. But anyways, you can find his stuff at irrussianality.wordpress.com, also on Telegram at irrussian. Welcome back to TNT Radio, Professor Robinson.
Hello, my pleasure.
So I've noticed you. I think your Twitter is dead, and you've stopped writing for op-eds for RT since the Russian invasion, I think. But I think you update your blog. Where are the best? Just for us to know the best places for people to find you on the World Wide Web these days.
Well, I'm writing a monthly column for a magazine called Canadian Dimension, and whenever I do that or write something else, I do put a link on the Irrationality blog. I mean, otherwise the blog I'm not putting new stuff on the blog itself at the moment, but I am putting links on there to anything which I do. So, something like this, when it's available online, I'll put a link on there so people can see it.
Yeah, I was looking for your stuff, and I did find you on Canadian Dimension, which I also enjoy reading. And I wanted to get you back, just to get your latest thoughts on where we are with Ukraine, but maybe to start with the, historical context. I'm often getting people's thoughts as to what's going on there currently, but I think sometimes we need to take a step back for some historical context. I know you've written a number of books on Russian history, and in the past, for example, I've had an interesting interview with Swiss journalist Guy Matan, who wrote a book arguing that the West has hated Russia for 1,000 years, and your latest for Canadian Dimension discusses Nikolai Danilevsky, who you say adopted an organic view of the world. Human civilizations, he maintained, were organic beings that were born, matured, and died. None could be said to constitute the end of history. So this kind of idea of civilizational states. And so maybe get your thoughts on a bit of history and what can Nikolai Danilevsky teach us about today's struggle between East and West?
Yes, I mean, Danilevsky was born 200 years ago this month. Actually, last month, 28th of November was his birthday. And he's very important because a lot of later thinking, which appears in Europe, United States, and so on, about what you might call cyclical views of history or civilizational theories, such as Samuel Huntington. But going further back to Spengler's Decline of the West and other things, but they have adopted this what we might call civilizational concept. And one of the first people really to write about this and to create this idea was Danilevsky. Because the Russian relationship with the West has always been quite complicated. But Russian philosophers, even those who were called Slavophiles, nonetheless still regarded themselves as being in some way connected to the West and sharing a common Christian roots. Even though there was a division between Orthodoxy and Catholicism and Protestantism, they felt that, in some way this could eventually and should eventually be overcome, and that there should be some form of unity eventually. Danilevsky was the first one who said, well, no. He said, there is no historical determinism, right, which leads everybody towards the same thing, whatever that same thing may be. I mean, communists thought it was communism. Western liberals think it's Western liberalism, and so on. But Danilevsky was, one of the first people to say, actually, no, we're not all progressing towards the same common future. Rather, the world consists of distinct cultural historical types, as you call them, but nowadays we'd call them civilizations, distinct civilizations, each of whom is advancing on an entirely distinct path towards a unique future. And therefore, what applies to one civilization does not apply to another civilization. And so this is now a commonly used theme in Russian rhetoric. It's very widely accepted by Russian academics, specialists in international relations, and so on. And it has eventually become part of public discourse of officials, including Putin, and who use this to contrast the sort of Western liberal idea that really there is one universal truth, which is Western liberalism, and the aim is for everyone to move forward, to converge on this end of history in a sort of Fukuyama sort of way, and become like us, essentially. To which the Russians now contrast the sort of Danilevskian idea and say, no, the world is not all about everyone converging on the Western model and having to become like the West. The world is a diverse place with multiple civilizations, all of which have a right to develop entirely in their own way, and therefore the West has no right to tell them what they should or should not do. And therefore you have this sort of ideological division between the sort of historical determinist view in which everybody is marching towards a common future, and the civilizational view in which everyone is going in their own direction, regardless of each other.
Yeah, I think there is something to what Danilevsky says. There are a lot of things from the Western Judeo-Christian civilization that I enjoy, and that I would hope that other peoples around the world could and would enjoy. But I also believe that there is, there should be this sovereignty, and things shouldn't be imposed on people. We're going to jump to our news break. We'll be right back.
What station is this? News station.
Ladies and gentlemen, TNT Radio News.
This is James O'Neill with a check of today's headlines. President Biden announced a prisoner swap to free the star American basketball player Brittany Griner, who was convicted of possessing cannabis vape cartridges in Russia. There's been a 24-hour work stoppage at the New York Times, the first one at the newspaper in more than 40 years. Moore County in North Carolina had power and heat last night for the first time since last Saturday. The suspects responsible for the damage are still at large.
Christmas is like herpes.
Wait, what?
No matter what you do, it's gonna flare up once a year.
From our family to yours.
Happy holidays.
TNT.
Regarding that news item on the work stoppage at New York Times, Babylon Bee wrote a hilarious headline that said, "Disinformation down 92% as New York Times writers go on strike." But anyways, we're talking to Dr. Paul Robinson. He's written a lot of great books. You can find his books and stuff at irrationality.wordpress.com. And just regarding what we're talking about, Danilevsky, this idea of organic civilizational states and the West. What's your take on, from what I've seen, it seems for the longest time, Russia, including Putin, have been trying to join the West. I think there were times where they asked to join NATO, I think even in the 50s, and they have been attempting to cooperate with the West, but the West has sort of been pushing them away. Any thoughts on that?
When he came to power back in the early 2000s, or in 2000, Putin was very much in the westernizing camp. And so he was in that sense, a classic Russian westernizer who thought very much that Russia was a European state and that its future lay in Europe. But the Russians always talked, and even liberal Russians, in fact, always talked about a sort of a Europe stretching from Lisbon to Vladivostok, in which Russia would be essentially an equal partner to the west of Europe, to the rest of Europe. But this was never really on offer, to be honest, because Western states regarded Russia as, well, a defeated nation and economically weak, and didn't see any particular reason why they should give equal status to a country which, frankly, economically and politically and militarily wasn't equal at that time. And as a result, the Russians' vision of what it meant to be part of Europe was one which was always doomed essentially to be rejected, and consequently they turned against it. And this sort of civilizational thinking I was talking about has become more common. And of course, now with the war in Ukraine and the sanctions which have been imposed on Russia, there's a very real danger that this sort of civilizational difference might actually become a reality. Now, personally, I think that in many respects, Russia is probably more Western today than it ever was in the past. I was a student in the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union was a much more alien place than modern Russia is. So in many respects, Russia has been greatly Westernized in recent decades. But this political division is now so total that it runs the risk of creating a genuine civilizational difference, because we've cut everything off so that even the most basic cultural exchanges are no longer possible. So, as I said, as a student in the Soviet Union, it's almost impossible for a North American or Western European student to go and study in Russia right now. Okay, simple basic things like that, which existed even at the height of the Cold War, have been cut off, and I think this may well be a semi-permanent thing, which means that willy-nilly, right or wrong, whether they want to or not, Russians will have to develop in a separate direction, because we've essentially cut them off, and this, I don't see any likelihood of this changing in my lifetime, at least.
I would agree with what you said, that Russia right now is probably the most Western it's ever been. I was there 5 years ago, and they just had so many Western things. Well, I mean, I visited urban areas, Moscow, St. Petersburg. I did go to Kazan, but you could just see they were enjoying many of the same amenities that we have. You've got the Ubers, you've got alcohol, the same fast foods. They were just emulating a lot of things. So I would totally agree with you that it's probably never been more modern than it is today. And just on that thought of Eurasianism, you write how it crept into the Soviet Union in the Brezhnev era, influencing, among others, the ethnographer Lev Gumilyov. And, I also today, the name Alexander Dugin is brought up a lot. His daughter was recently assassinated. I haven't really had the time to delve into his work, but your thoughts on Lev Gumilyov as well as Dugin, and is he continuing this same line of thought, and how influential do you think he really is?
So the Eurasianists took this civilizational thinking and tried to sort of put it on what you might call scientific basis, and claim that the geographical space of Eurasia, which is sort of Russia and, well, essentially the old Russian Empire and what was later the Soviet Union, were a sort of natural, coherent identity which was distinct from anything else, distinct from Asia and distinct from Europe, because they had, Central Asia and Russia, the Eurasianists claim, had common linguistic roots, and they had common history, and they had, even common botany and common geography and all these things, right? Which meant that they together formed a natural whole. I think that some of the science here was perhaps more rather pseudoscience, and this is particularly true of Gumilyov, who had some very, very strange ideas about ethnicities as natural beings, as natural states of affairs. And he came up with some weird ideas about cosmic rays and stuff like this. It was a very, very strange. But it continued this idea that Russia and Central Asia and the Caucasus and so on were one natural being. And Dugin, who you mentioned, has continued this tradition. Though what Dugin says really is that Russia, he sort of argues the position, Russia's problem is that it's never been one nor the other. But it's sort of Western, but it's never been fully Western, because there's always been this sort of Eurasian pull as well. So putting it in another direction, but then it's never really been properly Eurasian either. And it's never been one nor the other. And this lack of fixed identity has caused immense problems. And therefore, what it really needs to do is to fully separate itself from the West and really create a Eurasian identity where it never really existed before. To which end, he argues, we've got to go through a sort of process of trying to work out what it means to be Eurasian. And so with Dugin, you get a very much a strong anti-Westernism and a very strong desire to fight back against forces of Western globalization, Western Germany, and to separate Russia from the West. How influential this is, I would say limited, in the sense that, you know, it's not like Putin listens to Dugin or has even met Dugin. When I met Dugin, I asked him this, he said, you know, he has no influence, is what he told me. But he what he does is he's what you might call, he represents in a society extreme way this intellectual reaction to the rejection by the West, which many have had, and also a rejection of postmodernity. So I think many, you know, Russian conservative thinkers even would say that, you know, they're not really anti-Western. They actually really love the West. Well, at least this is what Dugin told me. He said, I love the West, at least it was till 1980. And then from the 1980s onwards, something went wrong. And you all became postmodern, and now you've become woke and everything else. And, you know, the West just isn't the West anymore. And, you know, we're not prepared to go the same way. And therefore, if you want to go that way, fine, but we're not following. So there's a sort of reaction against postmodernism and a desire to return to, you know, what they would call modernity, which would be like pre-postmodernism.
And just regarding Dugin, just from the little that I gather from the different Telegram channels and clips here and there, I mean, would you say that perhaps culturally, like on segments of the Russian society or population, he is having something of an effect? No?
Well, I mean, it's always very hard to judge these things. If you go into a Russian bookstore, say you go into one of the main bookstores in Moscow, such as Biblioglobus, which is right center of downtown, and you go to the politics section, you'll find a lot of books by Dugin. He churns these out at a massive rate, and obviously someone is buying them, or they wouldn't be selling them, right? However, he's not someone who is given access to state TV or, you know, state radio stations and so on. So he has to rely on people who read his books. And, you know, even if they're sold in the main bookstores, it's not going to be like vast numbers of people, and people who choose to, you know, look on his blogs and so on, like so forth. So he has some reach, but it's not like he's getting into on the television screens of the average Russian.
Sort of like underground. And I did want to, we got a break coming up, and I didn't want to get your thoughts on Ukraine, but sort of like a segue to that is just yesterday or the day before, I can't recall, I got a call from a friend on the US-Mexico border. He works over in Texas. He's an evangelist. So he's I think he's also a Mexican citizen. But anyways, he goes on the Mexican side of the border in Reynosa, and he calls me and he tells me that in Reynosa, Mexico, there are now 1,000 plus Russians who are apparently fleeing Russia, I guess because of the draft, and wanting to get into the U.S. He sent me a photo of, I guess, one of the Russians' phones, and they're using Google Translate because they don't speak English. And one of the Russians says, "A war has now begun in our country, and many are being called to war with Ukraine. I, according to my convictions, cannot go to war." I also found it interesting that, I mean, if I were Russian, I wouldn't necessarily want to go to the U.S. If my countries were at war. I mean, if I'm going to flee Russia, I'll go, you know, Kazakhstan. I've lived in Mongolia. I can disappear to a bunch of countries, but I don't think I'd feel completely comfortable going to the enemy's country. But apparently these do, and it kind of goes to what you're saying, that many Russians do seem to like the West. I mean, any thoughts on these 1,000 plus Russians now in Mexico trying to make their way into the U.S. And apparently some have made their way into the been approved.
It seems a very odd way to go. I mean, given, you know, problems with, you know, gang violence and so on in northern Mexico associated with people smuggling and so on. I'm not sure it's something where I would just want to go to in the hope that I could get into the United States. Certainly there have been a large number of Russians who have left the country because they either oppose the war or they don't want to be mobilized. However, these are not representative of the entirety of Russian society. So the idea that these people, you can speak to these people and think you're hearing the voice of the average Russian, I think would be a mistake.
Would you say that the average Russian, I think, as you mentioned, a lot of these things are hard to gauge, but in terms of like general overall support for the war effort or not, what would be your sense?
Well, it's difficult for me to say because traveling there is quite difficult at the moment, but Russians are very patriotic people. And, even if people, even if you think your country has made a mistake and shouldn't be doing this, or it's not going well or whatever, the average patriotic person doesn't want his country to lose. Because defeat in war is even worse than victory in war, and therefore, come what may, they regard it as necessary to see this thing through to as positive as an outcome as is possible. And when they sense that the entire Western world is against them, that again produces a bit of a rally around the flag sentiment. So, I don't get the sense of like the average Russian think that invading Ukraine was a great idea. There is a strong patriotic element in Russian society, like war reporters, military bloggers, these kind of people. They have who are very pro the war, and they have very, very large followings on Telegram. About some of the more sort of patriotic war reporters, have about 1 million followers on Telegram, and much larger following than do say liberal Russians on Telegram channels. That said, although there is this patriotic element, I don't think everyone's like massively pro the war, but they're not. Now they're in it, they're not against it. See what I mean? They feel that one way or another, we've got to win this thing.
Yeah, I mean, once they're put in that position, that's just how it is. We're going to jump to our break. Again, people can go to Irrationality, that's 2 R's, irrationality.wordpress.com. Find some of Professor Robinson's, his op-eds, all of his material, his books like Russian Conservatism or Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich, Supreme Commander of the Russian Army, and many more. We'll be right back on TNT Radio.
Hollywood goes bonkers on climate yet again.
From Washington, D.C., this is the Morano Minute with your host, TNT Radio's Mark Morano.
Disney star actress Bette Midler goes on climate rant. Quote, "I have done my part. I bathe once a month. F you," unquote. So we're saved. Bette Midler bathes once a month. The planet is healing. Hollywood actor Ed Norton hits out at non-sustainable luxury tourism, urges certified standards of sustainability in tourism. Or put another way, restrict more people from traveling by making it more expensive. Actor Norton also lamented the number of people who get on planes. He may as well have just said only important wealthy people should be allowed to fly. But kudos to comedian Bill Maher, who declared that teenagers worried about climate should shut the bleep up. "You're using cars as much as we did," Maher said. Maher also praised private jets. Quote, "The only people who don't like private are the ones who can't." Now that's my favorite kind of Hollywood liberal. Honest, frank, and willing to say it like it is. This is Mark Morano for the Morano Minute on TNT Radio.
Challenging the consensus and debunking the narrative. This is Viewpoint.
Researcher Elizabeth Woodworth finds the mainstream media often confuses misinformation, which is unintentional, with disinformation, which is deliberate. Dictionary.com states that compared to misinformation, disinformation is a relatively new word, first recorded in 1965 to 1970. It's a translation of the Russian word desinformatia, in turn based on the French désinformer. In English, the prefix dis can be used to indicate a reversal or negative instance of the word that follows. Disinformation, then, can be understood as reverse information or anti-information, specifically created to deceive and misguide other people. The Oxford English Dictionary describes disinformation as the dissemination of deliberately false information, especially when supplied by a government or its agent to a foreign power or to the media with the intention of influencing the policies or opinions of those who receive it. Given these definitions, it is curious that partners of the Trusted News Initiative have identified a scattered online public as the source of intentional disinformation.
Info at your beck and call.
Accurate, clear communication.
And it keeps changing every day. Just tell your smart device to play
TNT Radio.
We are back on our final segment with Dr. Paul Robinson, professor at the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa, author of a number of books. I think the latest is Russian Conservatism, and you can find his stuff at irrationality.wordpress.com. And what's what's sort of your take on where we are at with the situation in Ukraine?
Right now, we're in a situation where there is no obvious settlement, a political settlement in sight. But neither side is in a position at this moment to obtain military victory in the short to medium term, which means, therefore, that we're likely to see the war continue for quite a while. Now, the Ukrainians had the initiative for a while in the autumn, from really sort of late August through to the middle of October. The Russians had exhausted themselves. They did not have nearly enough men to hold a front line, which is over 1,000 kilometers long. As a result of which, the Ukrainians were able to recapture a number of areas, such as the area on the right bank of the Dnieper River around Kherson, and some areas around Izium in Kharkov province. However, although the Ukrainians were able to make some advances, they were unable to strike what you might call a decisive blow, destroying the Russian army. In September, the Russians called up 300,000 reservists, several tens of thousands of which have now already reached the front line. Many more are still, most of them are still undergoing training. But the arrival of these mobilized reservists has been sufficient to stabilize the front line. And although I wouldn't say that the initiative is entirely passed from the Ukrainians at this point, and it's still possible that they might just be able to pull off one final offensive, it does seem to be swinging back a little bit towards the Russians. And possibly the opportunity the Ukrainians had to win a decisive victory is slipping away. And the question now then arises whether these mobilized Russian troops will be able to themselves launch an offensive in the new year and swing the initiative decisively back towards the Russians. Now, I'm not in a position to say whether that is the case or not. But right now, the front lines are more or less stable. Neither side is making significant progress. It's a very old-fashioned war in many ways, in which conventional forces blast away at each other, expending enormous volumes of ammunition in order to make very small territorial gains, rather reminiscent in some respects of the First World War. It's industrial war of a type which people thought was a thing of the past, and it's likely to continue for quite a while.
Yeah, it seems like from the get-go that whether it was the Kremlin bots or the NATO bots, I think both projections from both sides have not been wholly accurate. There was the Kremlin bots saying Russia would sweep in and destroy Ukraine quickly. And here we are, 10 months later, and as you mentioned, it's almost like a stalemate, and that didn't happen. Or NATO, which says that they contradict themselves, where they say Russia is losing, but at the same time they say, we need all of these arms and all of these weapons. Well, if Russia is losing, why do you need all all of this stuff as well? So it seems that's sort of where we're at. And I mean, I have no idea how all of this will end. I don't know if you saw that clip. I saw a clip. Apparently there was some TV show from like 2019 or earlier that depicted exactly what's going on, like a Russia invading Ukraine, where ultimately Russia takes some gains, like these 4 breakaway republics, and then they sort of make a settlement there. I mean, ideally, we want some agreement to happen, but I think just yesterday or the day before, Putin came out again saying that the risk of nuclear war has increased. So, I mean, do you have any idea how this could potentially end with some, hopefully, agreement, or what's your take on the real threat of escalation?
I really am not sure how this will end. And I don't like predicting so much could happen. I don't at this moment see how a negotiated settlement could be reached, because I don't think that either side is capable of accepting the demands of the other. The best I think we could probably hope for is that at some point or other, one side or the other gains a sufficient advantage over the other, or there is a sufficiently long stalemate that some sort of ceasefire is agreed to, whereupon the conflict is frozen upon the existing line of contact without an agreement. So a bit like the end of the Korean War, where there's never been a peace treaty. We're stuck with where the line stopped. So I suspect that is the most likely outcome. Neither side, I think, really would trust whatever the other side would promise in any peace agreement. The Russians are certainly of the point of view that the Ukrainians signed a peace agreement back in Minsk in February 2015, and simply refused to carry it out, and basically can't be trusted to sign another peace agreement. The Ukrainian view is likewise, but the Russians can't be trusted. And therefore, I think it's going to be very, very, very difficult to actually have an agreement and anything more than a ceasefire. But even a ceasefire is going to require some change in the current military dynamic. So ultimately, something's got to happen on the battlefield. Either, one side or the other achieve some decisive success, or alternatively, they're in a stalemate which has lasted so long that it's become obvious they're not going to go on anymore. And both sides realize they can't make any progress. But that has to go on for a long time, right? So I'm not very optimistic, frankly, at this point in time.
What do you make of this headline that came out today? I honestly think it's a bit silly, but it says Putin has a plan to flee to South America if he loses the war in Ukraine. This is coming from an ex-Russian speechwriter who's been living in exile for a decade. It says it involves fleeing to Venezuela. Yeah.
I read so much garbage about Putin. He's suffering from about 20 terminal illnesses, according to our press. So I'd take all that with a pinch of salt, to be honest.
Yeah, we got just I think 2 minutes to midnight. Real quick, I don't know if you heard of the story with Alina Lipp, the German-Russian journalist. She's been on TNT before, but apparently she had her Berlin and Brussels shut off her bank account, as well as her mother's and her father's. And back in April, the Department of Homeland Security told PayPal to shut off my PayPal account. I'm banned from PayPal. What does it say about the West? I mean, is it because we are in a war, so that we're like under martial law, so they're doing these things to Europeans and Americans like myself? Or I don't think this is very, very democratic or very freedom-like. Any thought on that?
Well, we've reached absurd levels. So the one remaining Russian liberal TV station called TV Rain, TV Dozhd, was banned in Russia at the start of this war and fled to Latvia. The Latvians have now banned it, even though it is like totally anti-Putin and totally anti the war, because they were not like sufficiently anti-war and anti-Putin enough for the Latvians. And now Lithuania has banned them and Estonia has banned them. So we've reached the stage where people banned by Putin are being banned by us for not being sufficiently anti-Putin. We have reached a position where anything other than total adherence to the most extreme orthodoxy is simply not tolerated. And this is a very bad position.
We're out of time. Thank you for joining us again, Professor Paul Robinson. Check out irrationality.wordpress.com and some of his books, Russian Conservatism. Thank you again, and I'll be right back after this break.